Today I'm going to be reviewing the Forbidden Druid V2. At this point I've ridden this bike pretty full on for about 4 months. I've ridden it everywhere from the Whistler Bike Park to backcountry missions. I did an enduro race where I got third on it, and I've hit some sketchy urban stuff, some jibs. At this point I feel like I have a pretty good idea of what this bike's about, so let's get into it. This bike is an S3. It's in the mullet configuration and I'm 6'1". And I think a good reference point is the old bike. I rode the old Druid quite a bit and the old Dreadnought. The old bike was a bit of a conundrum because it was such a monster of a 130 bike. It kind of put it in this weird category of hanging with like 160 legit enduro bikes, but it's a 130 bike, so it's like, really, where does it fit? So with the Druid V2, we'll get into details later, but overall, I feel like they came out with something that still has a very high ceiling like the Druid V1, but is overall a much more approachable package. And I think the main way they did that is through the suspension package. The original was a linked single pivot. This is an upside down horse to link. I feel like they've brought a lot more feel into the suspension package, made the initial part of the travel way more supple. I can feel the ground through the bike a lot better on the original Druid. It was almost a disconnect between what the bike was doing and what I was feeling, and that gave me a lot of confidence because it muted so much of the trail, but it just made it a bit of a weird experience for a 130 bike. This suspension layout, they've integrated way more feel. There's way more suppleness, and the beginning half of the travel is just way friendlier and way more active. And I'll put some of the kinematic comparisons up on the screen right now, but I think they mainly did that through a lower anti-rise number and a slightly less rearward axle path. I'm sure there's other things that are going on, including a new shock and shock tunes and all that. The lower anti-rise number makes the bike not squat as much when you're under the brake, so it keeps a little bit more of that travel available to be active. And then not having as rearward of an axle path makes this bike feel not as much of a sled as the old bike. So with all those changes, I feel like the threshold of the bike is still insanely high for a 130 bike. There's not many bikes I would take to the Whistler Bike Park in this travel range and ride at the level I did. Like hucking off Detroit Rock City, if you're familiar with that feature, is no joke. You're guaranteed gonna bottom out and you have to like get composed before a right-hand corner. And I had a lot of confidence sending off that drop with this bike. The other contributing factor is the geometry. Geometry is what initially drew me to Forbiddens in the first place. I was experimenting with chainstay lengths, and Forbidden is definitely, I think, an outlier in the category of having proportional chainstay lengths to every size. If companies are lengthening chainstays at all, it's usually very incremental, but Forbidden actually goes off of a set ratio, front to rear center ratio that they apply to all their bikes. And in an S3, that puts the rear end at 452 millimeters with a 475 millimeter reach. And I've really come to appreciate the handling characteristics of longer chainstay bikes, especially this being a high pivot. It's a 460-ish rear end at sag. You're dealing with a bike that's gonna handle dramatically different to something that's like much more standard for the category that has like a 435 mil chainstay. So for me, what that does is it adds a lot of wheelbase and stability to the bike, but putting it in the rear end, but putting the length in the chainstay makes it so we can still have like a reasonable reach. And I really like being able to articulate the bike with my upper body and not be super stretched out. And then the longer chainstay helps plant the front wheel with the weight you have sitting in your feet. So you're not relying on throwing your body weight forward to get the front wheel weighted. So that allows me to ride in a much more neutral position because I'm not always having to manage like a front end grip issue. It's not something I'm having to worry about. I'm able to run my bars a lot higher because the front wheel is weighted. So that is kind of the setup that allows you to counteract a lot of like the negative, like less playful elements of a longer rear end, because this whole setup allows you to run higher bars And then with the higher bars, you gain a little bit more leverage over the long rear center to like manual and bunny hop it. Plus those high bars just put you in a really confident position. So I think they went about it in an interesting way where they designed super confidence inspiring geometry with a very capable suspension package, but then brought the liveliness and support into the bike by going to a bit of a lower travel number, but being able to do so because they were able to get so much stability and performance out of the bike, even with that lower travel number. This bike still is fairly efficient. Like pumping the bike, I feel like there's still a ton of support and the bike is responsive. I just think with the longer rear end and the rearward axle path, just the timing is a little bit different. And as long as you have a big enough area to pump, the bike responds really well, but it just doesn't do as well in those like little pockets and like getting those really like twitchy fast maneuvers. This bike's really good at setting a line, carving it. You can still corner really, really well in the tighter stuff. All you have to do is like weight your body a little bit forward, the rear end breaks loose and you drift around. Where it's maybe not as good at is in really, really janky stuff where you're not able to slide and like there's a rock and rooty crap kind of preventing you from like sliding the rear end around. I think for like 90% of corners, I find this bike corners incredibly well. And I'm still able to throw the bike around without it feeling like twitchy or like I'm like super on edge. I feel like the geometry of the bike has my back, so I really have the confidence to huck it into a drift or flick, Scandi flick a corner and just like, I don't have like an apprehension that the bike's gonna get away from me, so it almost gives me more confidence to be more aggressive with my riding. But I do think overall the bike carves a bit wider lines and like really smooths out your riding. I just got done riding the Specialized Stump Jumper 15 that just came out, and the bike definitely is a lot sharper, responsive. Things just seem to happen faster on it. Much shorter chainstay, similar reach, but like the rear end can like ping pong, one way or another really quickly, which can be really fun and set you up good for some corners, but it doesn't have that same confidence with the front end being planted. And this bike just handles those situations a little differently and is a bit calmer. It's not gonna have that like fast twitch handling characteristic that some people might enjoy, but it is possible to ride this bike in a really creative and fun way. Just the timing and character of it is a little different. For me, it's something I've really enjoyed, and I've had some really, really good moments on this bike. And overall, I feel like my riding is really consistent. I haven't had a hugie on this bike, and I've been able to ride it at a fairly high level, fairly safely, which is part of the reason I was drawn to like this geometry concept and why I've been really vibing with it. So moving on to other things, I think the chassis of the bike is super well balanced from a flex perspective. It's not something I ever really noticed. Like there wasn't a situation where I was like, oh, this bike's really stiff, it's kind of throwing me offline. And then in the corners, I was never like, oh, this bike is super flexy. Other bikes like that are on either extreme, like I definitely noticed that, but it was never something that like popped into my mind as like a primary concern. So maybe I just don't have good feedback on this, but it never was an issue for me in either extreme. So I think they strike a really good balance. And then climbing, I think this bike puts you in a really comfortable position. Long chainstay bikes, they honestly allow you to stay in a fairly upright position and still keep the front wheel down. I think they might not be as good for technical climbs, but I don't do a ton of that around here. The suspension had plenty of support. I don't really mess with the climb switch on this bike. I'm not too concerned about climbing, but this bike definitely felt like it climbed well from a suspension and geometry standpoint. One thing that definitely is a factor is the idler pulley. On this iteration, they didn't need a lower guide, which definitely helps. And overall, I'd say it's not a huge factor, but with every high pivot bike I've had that has an idler, As soon as the chain gets dry, it starts to make noise, and I do feel the drag. So as long as the drivetrain's clean and well lubed, it's really not a factor. But as soon as you slack on your drivetrain maintenance, it can really come to bite you. And I've been on backcountry rides where the chain's dry and it's kind of pissed, and it is pretty annoying. So just something to be aware of. I think I've like bolt checked this bike a few times. Maybe I got like a little turn out of some of the bolts, but nothing concerning. The frame still feels super smooth. There hasn't been any like durability or maintenance issues that I've run into. One thing I will say is it's extremely quiet. Whatever they've done with the chain protection and like routing of that chain, the bike is dead quiet. Maybe started to make a little bit of noise towards the end of my time with it, but that was like the standout thing I noticed on my first ride is like this bike is dead silent. So you gotta love that. I mean, a quiet bike's a fast bike, and this bike makes it really easy to have a quiet bike. It does have frame storage, that little guy under the down tube here. It's not super easy to use. You have to thread it in, and sometimes the threads can be like a little finicky. The opening's not super big, so it's not the best, especially when you compare it to what Specialized has going on, but it is usable and it's a nice feature to have. So overall, if you can't tell, I really like this bike. This has to be one of the best bikes I've ever ridden. It just checks a lot of boxes for me. You know, I might be an outlier. I ride at a fairly high level. I appreciate a certain ride characteristics when it comes to front end traction and the geometry that this bike has. So take that for what you will. And having this be a bit of a shorter travel platform, it still brings a lot of like liveliness and fun into the riding while retaining like an incredibly high threshold for a 130 mil bike. And I think this could be a quiver killer for a lot of people. I think people that are kind of looking at 150 mil bikes should be looking at this thing, because it does well as a short travel rig, but it can hang when you like go to a gnarlier place, even a bike park. Like this thing isn't going to be out of place. It might beat you up a little more, but the package is there for you to ride this thing at a crazy high level. I wouldn't hesitate to take this enduro racing. I believe the EWS or EDR team was racing the Druid with like a 160 or 170 fork when it first came out. So if you appreciate the handling characteristics I talked about and are in the market for a shorter travel package, and you like to kind of push the bike's limit, and you need something that'll keep you safe when you take the occasional trip to a shuttle spot or bike park, I think this could have, you know, all those bases covered fairly well. It's not going to be as much of a specialist as a like thoroughbred 130 trail bike or thoroughbred enduro bike, but it has one foot in each of those camps, and I think it spans that range really well. So I think Forbidden killed it with this thing. They updated the bike in the direction I hoped they would, just being a little bit more approachable than the old bike, a little easier to ride, but still retaining that like crazy high threshold you get from well thought out suspension layout, confidence inspiring geometry, and then they brought a bit of responsiveness back into the bike by kind of putting it in this lower travel category. So that's what I think's going on here. Let me know if you guys have any questions. Let me know if you guys have ridden this thing. Hope you guys enjoyed, and I'll catch you guys in the next video.